The Grand Carter mansion, silence reigned, except for the sharp voice of Mrs. Carter. "Jessica! Where is that useless girl?" she screamed, her voice echoing down the long hallway. Jessica, a 25-year-old orphan, rushed in from the kitchen, her heart pounding. She wiped her sweaty hands on her faded dress and stood before Mrs. Carter, keeping her gaze on the polished marble floor. "Yes, ma'am," she answered softly. Mrs. Carter's piercing eyes scanned Jessica from head to toe. "Are you deaf? When I call, you run, you don't stroll like a lazy rat." Jessica clenched her fists behind her back but nodded. She had long learned never to talk back. The Carter family was one of the wealthiest in Lagos. Their mansion had golden chandeliers, imported furniture, and walls decorated with paintings worth more than Jessica could earn in a lifetime. But Jessica, who had been working for them for 3 years, had never been treated as a human being. She cooked, cleaned, washed clothes, ran errands, and even took care of their children, all while Mrs. Carter insulted her at every opportunity. "You're too slow. Did you touch my jewelry? Thieves like you can never be trusted. You eat too much. You didn't come here to finish my food." Mrs. Carter's words cut deeper than a knife. Even though they had more than enough food in the house, she often snatched Jessica's plate and threw her food into the trash, laughing as Jessica's stomach growled. The night was dark, but inside the Grand Carter mansion, golden chandeliers glowed like tiny suns. The house was filled with expensive paintings, silk curtains, and floors so polished they reflected the ceiling. But behind all the luxury, a young woman stood in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes with trembling hands. Jessica's fingers were sore, her back ached, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She knew that if she rested for even a second, Mrs. Carter would find a reason to yell at her again. Outside, rain pattered against the windows, whispering secrets to the wind. Inside, Jessica's stomach growled, but she dared not eat. The last time she had been caught having a meal, Mrs. Carter had thrown her plate on the floor and called her ungrateful. And then, as if summoned by her thoughts, footsteps echoed down the hallway. "Jessica!" A sharp voice pierced through the silence. Jessica froze. She quickly dried her hands on her apron and hurried towards the voice. As she entered the dining room, she saw Mrs. Carter standing by the table, her eyes burning with anger. A glass of juice lay spilled on the white marble floor, glistening like melted gold under the chandelier. Jessica's heart pounded. "Look what you've done!" Mrs. Carter shrieked, pointing at the mess. Jessica blinked in confusion. "But I didn't do this." The words were on her lips, but she swallowed them. She had learned long ago that speaking back would only make things worse. She quickly grabbed a mop and rushed forward to clean the spill. But in her haste, her foot slipped. The world seemed to move in slow motion. She reached out for something, anything to steady herself, but there was nothing to hold on to. Her body hit the floor with a hard thud, and a loud crash followed. For a moment, silence swallowed the room. Then came the sound of something breaking, something expensive. Jessica turned her head in horror. On the floor beside her lay a shattered figurine, a golden statue of a dancing woman. It had once stood proudly on a nearby glass table, a piece so rare that Mr. Carter had said it was priceless. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Carter's face twisted with rage. "You useless girl! Do you know how much that cost?" Jessica's hands trembled as she tried to explain. I slipped. It was an accident." "An accident," Mrs. Carter repeated, her voice dripping with venom. "Do you think I care? Do you think you can just ruin things in this house and get away with it?" Tears stung Jessica's eyes. She had worked tirelessly for this family, giving them every ounce of her strength, but none of it mattered. "Get out." The words fell like a hammer on Jessica's heart. She blinked, sure she had misheard. "Ma, please, I have nowhere to go." "I said get out." Mrs. Carter grabbed Jessica by the arm and yanked her to her feet. She shoved her towards the door. "I should have thrown you out a long time ago. Get out of my house and never come back." Jessica stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned to the grand staircase, hoping, praying, that Mr. Carter or one of the children would come to her defense. But the house remained silent. No one cared. With shaking hands, she opened the door. The wind howled outside, the rain slapping against her face as if the heavens themselves were punishing her. She turned one last time, hoping for mercy. But Mrs. Carter's cold eyes stared back at her. "Don't ever step foot here again." And with that, the door slammed shut. Jessica stood outside the mansion, her clothes soaked through, her heart shattered. She had nowhere to go. No family. No friends. She wandered aimlessly through the streets of Lagos, her feet splashing through puddles, her mind numb with disbelief. She had spent years in that house, working like a slave. And now, in a single moment, she was nothing. She wrapped her arms around herself as the cold bit into her skin. She had no money, no food, and no idea where she would sleep that night. Her stomach growled, but hunger was the least of her worries. She walked past bright restaurants filled with rich people laughing and eating meals she could never afford. She passed luxury cars, the sound of their engines reminding her that the world kept moving, even as hers had crumbled. Hours passed. At some point the rain stopped, but the night remained cruel. She found a narrow alley and crouched in a corner, hugging her knees. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She had always dreamed of a better life, but tonight, the world seemed to have swallowed her whole. Jessica lay curled up in a corner of a dark alley, the rough ground pressing against her back. Her clothes were still damp from the rain, and her fingers felt stiff from the cold. The night air was cruel, wrapping around her like a serpent, whispering reminders of her fate. Her stomach growled loudly. It had been nearly 24 hours since she had eaten anything. She closed her eyes tightly, willing herself to forget the hunger, but it was impossible. People walked past the alley, their laughter echoing through the streets. The city of Lagos never truly slept. The rich still filled the restaurants, still clinked their wine glasses, still lived in a world Jessica could only dream of. But she was no longer a part of that world. She was just another nameless soul lost in the city. The next morning, Jessica woke up with the first rays of the sun shining in her eyes. Her body ached, but she forced herself to stand. She needed to find food. She wandered through the streets, looking for any small job she could do. She approached roadside sellers, asking if they needed help washing plates or sweeping, but most just waved her away. By noon, her feet were blistered from walking. Finally, she found an elderly woman selling roasted corn by the roadside. "Please, Mama," Jessica begged, "let me help you. I can clean, I can cook. Just anything in exchange for food." The woman looked at her closely. Jessica knew what she saw. A girl with tired eyes, a dirty dress, and no hope in her face. The woman sighed and handed Jessica a small ear of corn. "I don't need help, but eat this." Jessica's hands shook as she accepted it. She muttered a weak "thank you" before sinking her teeth into the food. Tears filled her eyes as she chewed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. But she couldn't live like this forever. She needed shelter. As the sun set over Lagos, Jessica wandered towards the quieter parts of the city, where large uncompleted buildings stood like abandoned castles. She found one that seemed empty. It was dark, the walls still bare, with no windows or doors yet fixed. But to Jessica it looked like home. She stepped inside and curled up in a corner. The ground was hard, the night air slipped through the cracks, but at least she was safe from the streets. She made this her routine. Every morning, she left the building to find small jobs, washing plates at food stalls, carrying loads for traders, sometimes even begging when she had no other choice. At night, she returned to the uncompleted building, wrapping herself in her own arms, whispering to herself that she would survive. Days turned to weeks. She learned which food vendors were kind enough to give her leftovers. She learned which areas were safe to sleep in and which ones weren't. She was surviving, but she was still a ghost in the city. No home, no future. And then one morning everything changed. Jessica had overslept. She was used to waking up before dawn and leaving before anyone could find her. But last night, exhaustion had won. When she finally opened her eyes, she heard voices. Loud voices. Who left their belongings here? Jessica's heart stopped. Footsteps echoed through the building, growing closer. Before she could gather her thoughts, a group of construction workers entered the room. For a moment, they all just stared at each other. Then one of the men called out, "Boss, you need to come and see this." Jessica scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. A few moments later, a tall Korean man entered the room. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark trousers and expensive shoes. His presence alone made the entire room fall silent. His eyes landed on Jessica. He didn't speak at first. Jessica swallowed hard. She had no idea who he was, but it was clear from the way the workers looked at him that he was important. The man stepped closer. His gaze was unreadable. "Who are you?" he asked in a deep, calm voice. Jessica opened her mouth to answer, but shame weighed her down. She looked down at her bare feet, at her torn dress, at the dirt on her skin. This was the moment she had feared, being caught, being thrown out once again. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of shouting, instead of calling security, the man turned to his workers. "Leave us." The men hesitated, looking at each other, but no one dared to question him. Within moments, the room was empty, except for Jessica and the stranger. The man turned back to her. "Tell me," he said. "Why are you sleeping in my building?" Jessica felt her lips tremble. She had not told anyone her story since the night she was thrown out. But as she looked into the man's eyes, something inside her broke. She told him everything. She spoke of her parents' death, of working as a maid for the Carters, of Mrs. Carter's cruelty, of the broken figurine, and of the night she was cast out into the streets. She told him about the hunger, the cold, the fear of sleeping alone in an uncompleted building. By the time she finished, her voice was shaking. The man remained silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "I see." Jessica had expected him to walk away. "My name is Ju-won," he said. "Come with me." Jessica stared at him. Come with him. To where? She hesitated, fear creeping into her heart. But then she looked at his eyes again. There was no cruelty in them. No mockery. For the first time in weeks, someone was looking at her like she was human. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Okay." Jessica followed Ju-won out of the uncompleted building, her heart pounding with every step. She had no idea where he was taking her, but something in his voice, something in the way he had listened to her story, made her trust him. Outside, a sleek black car waited. She hesitated. This was the kind of car she had only seen rich men drive, the kind of men who lived in mansions and had everything at their fingertips. "Get in," Ju-won said simply. Jessica swallowed. She was dirty, wearing rags, and smelled of the streets. The thought of sitting inside such a luxurious car felt wrong. Ju-won seemed to notice her hesitation. He sighed and opened the back door for her. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you." Jessica took a deep breath, then climbed in. The car smelled of leather and something expensive she couldn't name. The seat was so soft that she almost melted into it. The driver started the engine and soon, the car glided smoothly through the streets of Lagos. Jessica sat stiffly, staring at her reflection in the tinted window. She looked out of place here. Ju-won didn't speak for a long time. Then, without turning to her, he asked, "Do you know who I am?" Jessica shook her head. He let out a small chuckle. "I'm one of the biggest real estate investors in this country. I own over 50 properties. And I'm building 10 more as we speak." Jessica blinked. 50. She couldn't even imagine owning one small house. "So why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ju-won didn't answer immediately. He stared ahead deep in thought. "Because I can." Jessica frowned. That's not a real answer. This time he turned to look at her. "I grew up poor too, Jessica." She stared at him in shock. He didn't look like someone who had ever suffered. Everything about him, his expensive clothes, his confident posture, the way people listened to him, screamed powerful man. But you're rich. Ju-won gave a small smile. Now I am. But when I was a child my family had nothing. I know what it means to go to bed hungry. I know what it means to feel like the world has forgotten you. Jessica's heart clenched. For the first time in a long time someone understood. Someone saw her. The car slowed down, and before she could ask another question, Ju-won spoke again. We're here. The gates of Ju-won's mansion swung open, revealing a house that looked like something out of a fairy tale. The compound was massive, lined with palm trees and glowing lanterns. The house itself was a masterpiece. White walls, high windows, and balconies overlooking a swimming pool that shimmered under the afternoon sun. Jessica's mouth went dry. This wasn't a house. It was a palace. The car stopped and Ju-won stepped out. Jessica followed hesitantly, afraid her bare feet would dirty the spotless floors. A woman dressed in a neat uniform hurried towards them. Sir, should I prepare your food? She asked. Ju-won shook his head. Not yet. But bring some clothes and food for Jessica. The woman's eyes flickered to Jessica, but she said nothing, just nodded and hurried inside. Ju-won turned to Jessica. You'll stay here for now. Jessica's eyes widened. Here. Boy. Ju-won gave her a steady look. Because I won't let you go back to the streets. Jessica felt her throat tighten. No one, not one single person, had ever shown her this kind of kindness. I can work, she blurted out. I can clean, I can cook, Ju-won held up a hand. You don't have to prove anything to me. But if it makes you feel better, you can help around the house for now. Jessica let out a shaky breath. She had a job. She had a place to sleep. For the first time since being thrown out of the Carter mansion, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow would bring. The days passed quickly. Jessica worked hard, keeping the mansion spotless. But unlike at the Carter's house, no one screamed at her. No one humiliated her. The other workers were kind. The cook gave her extra food when no one was looking. The driver taught her how to pronounce the names of different cars. The gardener let her water the flowers. And Ju-won. He watched her carefully. One evening, as she was setting the table for dinner, he spoke. Jessica, do you want more than this? She looked up confused. More than what? Ju-won leaned against the counter, studying her. Do you want to keep being a maid forever? Jessica swallowed. She had never allowed herself to dream beyond survival. I don't know. Ju-won's gaze softened. Then let's find out. The next morning he brought a tutor. From now on you'll study, Ju-won announced. You'll learn everything you need to build a future for yourself. Jessica's hand shook. No one had ever believed in her like this. She stared at the stack of books placed in front of her. She was scared. Scared of failing, scared of proving that she wasn't smart enough. But Ju-won was watching her. And for some reason, she didn't want to disappoint him. She picked up a pen. And for the first time in years, she dared to dream. Jessica sat at the large wooden desk in Ju-won's study, staring at the pages of an open book. Letters swam before her eyes, forming words she could barely understand. The tutor, a kind middle-aged woman named Mrs. Adams, stood beside her, patiently waiting for Jessica to attempt the exercise. But Jessica felt frozen. The pen in her hand felt heavier than a stone. The words on the page looked like a puzzle she wasn't meant to solve. She wasn't smart enough for this. She was just a maid. She clenched her fists, shame burning in her chest. Ju-won's voice broke the silence. Jessica. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway, watching her. He didn't say much, but the look in his eyes said everything. Why? Jessica swallowed hard, gripping the pen tighter. She took a deep breath. And she began. First the words came slowly. The sentences were shaky, her handwriting uneven. But with each passing day she improved. She learned to read faster, to write better, to think beyond what she had always known. She studied late into the night, her candle burning until the wax melted into nothing. She struggled. She failed. She cried in frustration when she couldn't understand something. But she never gave up. Ju-won had given her a chance, and she refused to waste it. Months passed, and the girl who had once been thrown into the streets with nothing was now learning about history, science, and business. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was growing. One afternoon, as Jessica left a bookstore with an armful of study materials, she heard a familiar voice. A sharp, cold voice she hadn't heard in months. It can't be. Jessica. Jessica froze. She turned slowly. There, standing under the shade of an outdoor cafe, was Mrs. Carter. The woman's eyes widened in shock. Her gaze traveled over Jessica, from her neatly braided hair to her clean, well-fitted clothes. Jessica no longer looked like the trembling maid who had been thrown into the streets. She looked different, stronger, healthier. Mrs. Carter's lips curled in disbelief. How are you still alive? Jessica's heart pounded, but she lifted her chin. I survived. Mrs. Carter scoffed. And where exactly did you find the money to dress like this? Did you become someone's mistress? Jessica's fists clenched. The pain of the past tried to rise within her, but she didn't let it. She had worked too hard, come too far, to let this woman's words break her again. I don't owe you an explanation, she said, her voice steady. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. You're still nothing, Jessica. No matter what clothes you wear, you'll always be a desperate little girl who was lucky enough to live in my house. Jessica took a step closer, her eyes burning with quiet strength. I was never lucky to live in your house, she said. You treated me like trash, but guess what? I didn't let it destroy me. I have a future now. I have people who care about me. And I don't need your approval to know my worth. Mrs. Carter's mouth fell open slightly. Jessica took a deep breath, turned around and walked away. For the first time in her life, she had won against the woman who had once held power over her. She felt free. 4 years later, Jessica stood on a grand stage, dressed in a beautiful graduation gown. The sun shone brightly overhead, and the crowd was filled with students, proud parents, and cameras flashing in all directions. Jessica's hands trembled as she received her diploma. She had done it. She had passed her exams, completed her degree, and built a future for herself. As she turned to step off the stage, her eyes searched for Ju-won. There he was, standing at the back, his arms crossed, a small smile on his face. Their eyes met. And in that moment Jessica realized something. She wasn't just grateful to him. She had fallen in love with him. Later that evening, as the graduation celebration wound down, Jessica found herself standing on the balcony of Ju-won's mansion, looking out at the city. She had changed so much. She was no longer the helpless girl who had slept in an uncompleted building. She was a woman now. A woman with dreams. Ju-won stepped onto the balcony, standing beside her. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then softly he said, I'm proud of you. Jessica's throat tightened. I couldn't have done it without you. Ju-won exhaled, shaking his head. No, Jessica. I only gave you an opportunity. You were the one who fought for this life. Jessica turned to face him. Her heart pounded in her chest. Ju-won's gaze was intense, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then, before she could stop herself, she blurted out, Why did you help me? Ju-won didn't answer right away. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Because from the moment I met you, I knew you were special. Jessica's breath caught. Her skin burned where his fingers had touched her. She searched his face, looking for the truth. And then, she saw it. In his eyes. In the way he looked at her. As if she was more than just another person in his life. As if she was everything. Her heart pounded wildly. It had been months since Jessica graduated, and life had become something she never imagined possible. She had secured a job with one of Ju-won's companies, working as a business consultant. She was no longer a maid, no longer a lost girl wandering the streets of Lagos. She was independent, strong, and respected. But there was one thing she couldn't ignore. Her heart. Every time Ju-won entered the room, her pulse quickened. Every time he smiled at her, a warmth spread through her chest. But she never dared to hope. He was Ju-won, a billionaire, a man who could have any woman in the world. She was just Jessica. And then one evening everything changed. Ju-won invited her to dinner. But it wasn't at his mansion or a restaurant. It was on a rooftop. A breathtaking rooftop garden, filled with fairy lights and flowers. The night sky stretched above them, a sea of stars twinkling like diamonds. Jessica gasped. "This is beautiful." Ju-won smiled. "Not as beautiful as you." Her heart pounded. They ate in silence, their eyes speaking words their lips refused to say. And then, just as she thought the night was ending, Ju-won stood. He reached into his pocket. And then, he knelt. Jessica's breath hitched. The world around her disappeared. Ju-won's voice was steady, but there was something raw in his eyes. "Jessica, I've spent years watching you grow into the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever met. You are not just someone I helped. You are someone I admire. Someone I love." Jessica's hands flew to her mouth. Love. Her heart raced so fast she thought it might burst. Ju-won opened a small velvet box, revealing a stunning diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Jessica's eyes. This couldn't be real. This had to be a dream. But it wasn't. It was real. And so was the love in his eyes. With a shaking voice, she whispered yes. Ju-won slipped the ring onto her finger, and as he stood, she threw herself into his arms. The moment his arms wrapped around her, she knew she was home. The news of their engagement spread like wildfire. Jessica, the orphaned girl who had once been a maid, was now engaged to one of the richest men in the country. People talked. Some admired her. Some were jealous. Some whispered that she didn't deserve him. But Jessica didn't care. She had fought too hard, endured too much, to let other people's opinions steal her joy. And when the wedding day arrived, it was the grandest event Lagos had ever seen. The venue was decorated with gold and white roses, the air filled with the scent of fresh blossoms. Celebrities, politicians, and business moguls filled the grand hall. And then, Jessica walked in, dressed in a breathtaking white gown, her veil trailing behind her like a river of silk. She was a vision of elegance. Gasps filled the room. Even the people who had doubted her couldn't deny the truth. She belonged here. She walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on Ju-won. He stood at the altar, dressed in a crisp white suit, looking at her as if she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Jessica's hands trembled as she reached him. The priest spoke. Vows were exchanged. And when Ju-won lifted her veil and kissed her, the world erupted in cheers. Jessica closed her eyes. She had dreamed of happiness. But this was beyond her wildest dreams. Somewhere in the crowd, standing in the shadows, Mrs. Carter watched. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her nails digging into her palm. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The same girl she had thrown into the streets like trash was now standing before her, wearing a gown worth more than Mrs. Carter's entire wardrobe. Jessica had become something greater than she ever imagined. And for the first time Mrs. Carter felt regret. But it was too late. Jessica no longer needed her approval. She had won. The years that followed were nothing short of a fairy tale. Jessica and Ju-won traveled the world together, built businesses together, and grew together. They had a love that was unbreakable, forged through hardship, strengthened by faith. Jessica never forgot where she came from. She opened charity homes for homeless children, making sure that no child ever had to sleep on the streets like she once did. She became a symbol of hope, a reminder that no matter where you come from, your story is not over. And every night, as she lay beside Ju-won, his arms wrapped around her, she would whisper, "Thank you." Not to Ju-won, not to fate, but to herself, the girl who never gave up. She had turned pain into power. She had turned suffering into strength. And now, she was finally living the life she had always deserved. Happily ever after.